The impeachment trial of President Yoon Suk Yeol enters its last week today, with two final hearings scheduled, and pundits believe the Constitutional Court will share its verdict on the case in March. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Tuesday, February 11th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today, President Yoon Suk Yeol was back at the Constitutional Court to attend the 7th hearing of his impeachment trial that began early this morning. For more on this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, welcome back.
Happy to be here.
Right, I also have Hwang Joung-wook, the head of LawQuant, joining our talk virtually. Mr. Hwang, it's been about a month since we last spoke, and it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Kelly, we will start here. Let's begin with some details from the latest hearing taking place today at the impeachment trial of President Yoon Suk Yeol.
Yeah, not too much came out of this particular hearing. As a reporter here at this point, it's starting to feel very incremental hearing to hearing. But what we do know is, in theory, this impeachment trial could end as early as next week, according to some South Korean media. It really depends on whether or not more hearings are going to be scheduled. Going into the 7th hearing, we did hear from the panel overlooking this case, and one of the lawyers on the panel had said that after 6 hearings, there's sufficient reason to believe that what President Yoon has done by declaring martial law is, at least on the books, illegal. In particular, another lawyer on the panel took issue with the cessation of political activities that was ordered during that martial law declaration, which we now know only lasted a couple of hours. But still, the constitutionality and the legality of, exercising that presidential power has been in question. And it sounds like we're going to find out whether or not he will, truly be upheld in his impeachment this month.
Right. And in the meantime, Mr. Hwang, could you give us a legal rundown, if you will, of the points of contention at the Constitutional Court as we speak?
Yeah, President Yoon's legal team has been trying to make the argument that President Yoon was justified in declaring the emergency martial law, and this was only a warning, and the various comments were made how this was not illegal or unconstitutional. I think fundamentally the problem is that the evidence that really weighs heavily against President Yoon were basically all public information. His televised speech declaring emergency martial law, as well as martial law decree, and the fact that we saw soldiers, special forces soldiers, parachuting into the National Assembly grounds and breaking into the place, breaking windows and so forth, blocking lawmakers from going in. So I think no matter what kind of arguments they try to form, I think those kind of core evidence is there for entire South Korean public to see in real time. And I think it kind of shows that the Yoon's legal team struggled against that overwhelming evidence that is there.
Mr. Hwang, some observers point out that judicial neutrality has come under intense scrutiny here in South Korea in recent times. How do you explain this reality, and do you suppose there is a productive way forward from this?
Well, I think it is a very concerning development. Basically, the way I see it is that President Yoon's legal team has very bad law on the case in terms of both law as well as background facts. So what they've done is to basically, make arguments that will rile up their far-right base. And we saw a very unfortunate, violent attack on the Seoul Western District Court as a result of this far-right wing of Korean society kind of riled up. And another push now is to attack these individual justices on the Constitutional Court, and very unfortunately, the ruling party key lawmakers are actually, chiming in saying that they're agreeing with that argument. And basically, in order to curry favors with the far-right elements of Korean society, all these politicians and lawyers are just spouting out these crazy conspiracy theories, to be frank with you. So I think from a political point of view, it's a very concerning development.
Right, and staying with concerns, Kelly, the foreign media, they've also been covering the reality that there is a a dramatic drop in public trust in mainstream media here in Korea in recent times, which we also covered a while back, I believe, Kelly. What do you suppose has been the impact of the political turmoil here on public trust in mainstream media?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a relationship there. To me, it's very akin to what we see happening in the United States, and I'm sure other countries around the world as well. That opinion piece briefly touched on this relationship of distrust between the South Korean public and the media. I'm not so sure if it's a failing of the mainstream media so much as Mr. Hwang mentioned, the media landscape is very different now. There's a lot of conspiracy theories being touted. In general, Korean media, you could argue, is very politically polarized. You have certain newspapers and outlets that you look to for certain political opinions and others that you look to for the opposite end of the spectrum. You could argue that about the United States as well. I think the other challenge that's kind of feeding into this phenomenon is, like Mr. Hwang said, when you have publicly elected officials that are forwarding conspiracy theories or alternative facts or other forms of information, it creates this cognitive dissonance for the public where it's politicians on one side portraying one reality and politicians on the other side portraying another reality. And the issue that the media has always been saddled with is we need to report what public officials are saying, but also to contextualize that. And so I think when you're dealing with a political landscape that is very polarized, you're also going to end up with a lot of confusion in the media. And it's a very difficult line to walk to try to contextualize these statements. And I think it also speaks to the fact that, as we discussed in previous weeks, there's a lot of prominent YouTubers and people who are kind of, grassroots media or self-styled journalists kind of being a part of this political lore. And so, unfortunately, I do think that this is something that's happening here, but everywhere else as well.
Right. Moving forward, aside from the impeachment trial, Mr. Hwang, President Yoon Suk Yeol faces the start of a criminal trial later this month on charges of insurrection. What are your prospects regarding this upcoming legal proceeding against the president?
Well, since it's a criminal trial, I think I expect for it to take a lot longer than the constitutional impeachment trial. But still, I mean, based on the key leading Korean judicial opinion and case with respect to insurrection, especially with respect to a coup, is the trial of former President Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-wook back in 1995, for which they received respectively a death sentence as well as life sentence. And there's a key 1997 Korean Supreme Court decision. Basically, that lays out, what a constitution constitutes insurrection. And I think just looking at the key facts I laid out, President Yoon declaring emergency martial law and that crucial martial law decree, and the fact that soldiers were sent into National Assembly, I think those facts alone make a fairly compelling case that, yes, it only lasted 2 hours, but it still was an insurrection. So I expect President Yoon's lawyers will also have a very tough time defending President Yoon in the criminal case.
Right. Mr. Hwang, some critics that is, they claim that the legal proceedings against President Yoon Suk Yeol are being rushed. How do you respond?
Well, from the constitutional court's perspective, I mean, for them, this is the single greatest issue facing the Korean government. We don't have a president, and the president actually, if the trial ends in a way that President Yoon is restored, we'll have a situation where a president who declared an emergency martial law is back in power with the power to declare martial law. So there's that uncertainty risk hanging over the Korean politics. So I think it makes sense. It's kind of reasonable common sense to expect constitutional court to resolve this issue as much as possible. Now, from the President Yoon's legal team's perspective, my guess is that what they're thinking is that they're trying to just buy more time. They're hoping that the political winds are changing, and it does seem like the political winds are changing a little bit. It seems that the far right wing of the South Korean society has definitely been riled up, and hopefully they're sort of hoping that this groundswell of feeling good about President Yoon will somehow overwhelm the courts. I mean, it is really far out idea, but it is one that they're trying in real time right now.
Right. In the meantime, Kelly, hypothetically speaking, if President Yoon Suk Yeol is indeed impeached, South Korea must hold an early election. And current surveys indicate that opposition leader Lee Jae-myung is a viable contender. However, Lee Jae-myung himself, he faces his own legal woes, I believe. Could you remind us about them?
Yeah, Lee Jae-myung faces a number of legal proceedings against him. He was also recently convicted and sentenced last year of violating an election law. For those who don't know, he ran for president the last time around in South Korea, and he lost by essentially a sliver to President Yoon. These cases are all extremely complicated. A lot of them date back to allegations that were made around his time as mayor and as governor of Gyeonggi province. They have to do with, things that he's said on the campaign trail, has to do with, a construction development project in the city of Seongnam. And so it's a lot to get into. But essentially what this would mean is, for instance, if his conviction is upheld in this most recent case, that would mean that he's not eligible to run for president. And so what we're seeing now is that there are accusations that he's trying to delay his proceedings further so that he can become eligible or remain eligible to be president and ultimately get elected and then deal with the fallout from there. In general, Lee Jae-myung is kind of a polarizing figure in South Korean politics, and as was mentioned earlier, those on the right are getting kind of a bit of momentum despite all the initial controversy with Yoon's declaration of martial law. And so there are actually two candidates that are polling right behind Lee Jae-myung for this potential election if Yoon's impeachment is upheld. And they tend to be more on the right wing. So we'll have to see what happens.
Right. Mr. Hwang, this is an impromptu question, but could you tell us a bit more about opposition party leader Lee Jae-myung's prospects of partaking in an early, that is, presidential election, given his legal woes?
Right. It really does seem like he is sort of playing for time, although the words he's been saying publicly says that he wants all these cases to be adjudicated as soon as possible so that people of South Korea will have, no suspicion about him. But if you actually look at the actual legal tactics he has employed in his, I think right now there are 5 active cases and 1 more that is about to be opened up. It does seem like he is employing a delaying tactic. And if you remember, a few months ago, he declared that he was actually going to give up his privilege as a lawmaker not to be arrested to actually reverse himself. So he's made some controversial actions in his cases as well as in his political action to, they were enough to arise suspicion that he's just delaying things. He will be barred from running for president if the final adjudication at the level of Korean Supreme Court comes out. And given the fact that this constitutional impeachment case against President Yoon is moving at a fairly brisk pace, it doesn't seem like we'll get a Supreme Court decision for any of Lee Jae-myung's cases. So if Lee Jae-myung is elected, again, it's a hypothetical, then all the cases will have to be suspended because you can't bring a charge against a sitting president except for insurrection, basically. So, but it is quite likely that at least one of the decisions that he actually was convicted in the trial court level might actually get an appeals court decision sometime next month before the presidential election. So how does that change the political landscape? Well, that would be one big risk factor we'll have to monitor.
I see. And beyond politics and perhaps onto diplomacy here in the country, Kelly, a recent opinion piece by The Diplomat claimed that foreign policy by the South Korean administration, regardless of which party gets power, if, of course, President Yoon Suk Yeol is indeed removed from office, will perhaps see the government, the new administration, if we have one, taking on a step back from perhaps pro-US policies to adopt or to go back to its more moderate or balanced foreign policy, if you will. Do you see this taking place, especially keeping in mind that the Trump administration is back in power in the White House?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I mean, when I hear this question, I think back to the time when President Moon was running for office, and I think he had said something, or maybe it was in the early days of his office, but he had said something along the lines of South Korea should be in the driver's seat. And that was a huge controversy at the time. So I just want to note that the rhetoric that has been about South Korea putting its interests first has never been a far cry from what has existed on the left or the right. South Korea in general is pretty pro-United States and vice versa in terms of its foreign policy decisions. With that said, President Yoon did do some notable things that were certainly in lockstep with the Biden administration. For instance, he traveled to Europe. I believe he was the first South Korean president to do so, to attend several NATO summits. He also kind of started to revitalize South Korea's relationship with Japan after years of tension there in the previous administration. But you could argue that both of these things are also in South Korea's interest and not just kind of pandering to the United States as a major partner. It certainly raises South Korea's profile to attend these NATO summits, especially as South Korea continues to be a major economic powerhouse globally. It makes sense that it might also do that geopolitically. The other thing is North Korea has really given a lot of indication that it's not particularly interested in dialogue at this point, in engagement. And so it's arguably in South Korea's interest as well to kind of create a more strong trilateral partnership with Japan and the United States. One thing that I will say is Trump coming into the White House does seem to mark a really different political calculation for South Korea. And certainly it would make sense for South Korea to put its own interests first when it's dealing with a president that is a little bit of a wild card in terms of what he may do. And he certainly also seems to have no issue putting the alliance under some scrutiny with his previous remarks saying that South Korea should pay for the U.S. troops' presence or that there should be some kind of renegotiation of trade agreements.
Right. With regard to the new Trump administration in the U.S., aside from its foreign policy, Mr. Hwang, President Trump's internal policies, if I may, in the U.S. have also caused quite a bit of criticism and concerns, of course. I'd like to take your attention to Trump's signing of an executive order to do away with birthright citizenship. Speaking within your capacity as a legal expert, what are your thoughts regarding this order? Is it possible? You have judges who've put it on hold.
Well, we'll see. I mean, more or less.
It's a difficult question.
Well, I mean, at least we have judges at the district court level who have, issued decisions blocking President Trump's orders. But at the end of the day, it will go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and let's be honest, by the vote of 6-3, the current U.S. Supreme Court is very, very friendly towards President Trump. So whether the strong normal rule of law that I thought existed in America will actually stand up against this dictatorial, simply put, this is dictatorial. And for those of Korean audience might not know this, but birthright citizenship means under the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment, the text clearly says if you're born in the U.S., you're a U.S. citizen. End of story, basically. And basically, President Trump is saying that, hey, I can override it by a presidential order. In the order of various legal laws and regulations and orders, presidential order ranks on the bottom, and the constitutional provisions rank as the highest law of the land. Whether that is true still in President Trump's America, I am not really sure. So we'll see. Right. And I have to say I'm very concerned.
Right. And staying with such concerns, Kelly, there is also a bit of concern about the crackdown by the Trump administration led by Elon Musk with regard to USAID. Now, quite a number of people have said efforts to shut down that particular agency will affect America's perhaps soft power with regard to its global partners. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of grew up in this political culture of, America styling itself as the world's police, but also kind of, the world's hero, using its economic capitalist power to help out nations around the world. That's kind of the climate that I was raised in, and you could argue that that's just rhetoric or propaganda. There's a lot of history behind that kind of sentiment. But either way, the United States essentially deciding as of now that it's going to pull back on these key programs that fund things like foods and medicines and tents all over the world. It certainly could weaken U.S. soft power. To the point about the previous question, I think what we're seeing right now is just a major upheaval in the American government. There's a lot of purging and uncertainty going on. It often starts as layoffs or deferred salaries and things like this, and then eventually can become a more permanent axing of major arms of the U.S. government. And so we'll have to see, but I think what we're seeing right now is an administration that acts first and worries about legal proceedings and appeals later on. So whether or not this change is permanent, I don't know, but it's certainly been a big talk at the Washington Post and elsewhere in recent weeks.
Right, affecting the FBI, the USAID, of course, and other agencies. Will have to wait and see then. All right, Kelly, thank you so much for taking my impromptu questions. And Mr. Hwang, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching.